Wow, thank you. We were just, while we were going up the stairs, me and Lucia were like, we don't want to say anything else. We don't want to add anything else. We just want to remain with these words and with the mood in which they put us. Between the too large and the too small, between a setting and a landscape and a potentially diluting landscape, which is ungraspable, and the garden and the life forms of the garden as an extension of the self and the extension of the domestic. I was fascinated by this constant interplay between what we understand and what we don't understand, and how the strange plays such an important role in this notion of the non-understanding, what you don't understand. And somehow I started imagining Emily Dickinson not understanding frost and therefore being scared of it. So more than a specific question, I guess my invitation also to remain with the suspended state in which your words left us. I wonder if you felt like reflecting a bit on this, on exactly these thresholds, if it exists, between understanding and non-understanding, which is something that traverses you both.
Is that me? Oh, definitely. I think one of the things I've realized in the past, I don't know how many years, is that I am perpetually riveted by things I can't understand, and that I often don't want to understand them, that the being riveted to them is not necessarily the desire to figure it out. And so one of the things I've been trying to do is think about how to write about, maybe writing is the wrong thing to do, but it's what I'm supposed to do, so I feel like, I'm like, wait a minute, I gotta find a way to write about this. How to find a way to write about or think about what happens in those places at the boundary and at the limit of understanding, and what kind of, I mean, the way I tend to think of it is what kind of affective work sitting with, reading, watching, looking at things that we can't comprehend does for us. You were talking in your paper about, it was so funny because you were talking about something that's not neither dystopic or utopic, and or who is it dystopic or utopic for, and I have just written a long thing that is exactly about that, and trying to think about whether the unsayingness of the mystical life presents a kind of atopia that's neither dis or you, but is something else, precisely standing in that place of a willing performance and practice of unknowability, which I think has to do with what I said at the beginning that I kind of forgot to go back to, but just, what are the practices by which we transform ourselves such that we can live potentially in the world that we are creating, but also resist aspects, resist the destruction of the world that would be nice, and yet things are going to be transformed, and how do we live in that place of transformation?
Yeah, I mean, the hell that is love is definitely both utopia and dystopia at the same time, and it's always both in different ways. I think I'm probably getting this quote wrong, but I think Agnes Varda said the best thing to do with an emotion you don't understand is to film it. And it's not that in filming it you understand it, but then the emotion gains its own form of intelligence, which is how I've been thinking about writing for a long time as well. This idea that trying to write something down doesn't mean trying to explain it. It's trying to give the experience a form of intelligence. So I use the word explain instead of understand, because I feel like explaining is what I'm resisting more than understanding, because I'd like to believe there are other kinds of understanding than the ones I'm supposed to have, using words and stuff.
Okay, so here's something that I
can't explain and don't understand, but absolutely obsessed with, which is this notion that metaphors are real. And this emerged when we started to research for this, and then it became this event on erotics and botany, and then from erotics and botany it became clear that you couldn't talk about erotics and botany without talking about agriculture and myth, and that as far back as you go, there's completely connected relationships between the poetry of 7,000 years ago and the practices of agriculture of 7,000 years, and so on and so on. And so it becomes quite clear that when it comes to plants, and again, don't understand it, can't explain it, so that when it comes to plants, a lot of the ways in which we refer to things through plants or through the vegetal as quote-unquote metaphor, and this is something that I picked up, you both mentioned in different ways. That when sort of there is somewhere some very far, deep, like, connection with actual plants, with the actual process of agriculture, or just like the question of divination being sort of like telling the weather, and the weather being about sort of planting the crops. So I wanted to ask you, like, can you please just put words around this feeling that metaphors are real and that they connect to plants somehow?
I don't know if I can, but I have two thoughts that may be helpful. One is that I do think sometimes metaphors are metaphors. Paul was using Paul was using the language of sowing and reaping as a metaphor. And in the context of a very complex set of letters in which he's trying to make a distinction between literal and spiritual meanings of Scripture. He was a trained rhetorician. I mean, he knew what he was doing. Do you know what I mean? So I don't want to disavow the fact that there is plenty of poetry, plenty of talk in the world around plants and around animality that are metaphors. But I am interested in the fact that as I read Dickinson, I realize, oh, these aren't for her. And similar kinds of things happen with the medieval material around love. So the love of the soul for God, which is read, people say, well, it's a metaphor. It's like, well, no, it's not. I mean, it's not a sublimation of human sexuality such that, sisters X and Y are getting it on and writing about it as if it's about God. But they are talking about erotic experiences with God. And so it's the ultimate, unknowable other with whom something that is spiritual and physical is happening. And so that the boundary between the literal and the spiritual becomes much more porous than Paul, for example, in the first century wanted it to be. I don't know what that says about plants, other than that, again, I think about somebody like Hadvig. She was an urban dweller, I don't know, but these people were surrounded with the natural world that they were absolutely dependent upon in every way, for whatever medicinal purposes were available, for whatever religious purposes, for eating, for living, you know what I mean? So it's hard to imagine that certain things that are read merely as allegorical figures or merely as metaphors could have been that for them. Because everybody wasn't a trained rhetorician like Paul was, right? But that doesn't go very far towards answering whether there's a deep history piece to it, which is what I think you're also asking about.
I mean, I think what was so revelatory to me about reading mystical encounters from many hundreds of years ago was precisely their literalness, because, for all the talk of hyperobjects and we can't access these unknowable ecosystems, it's like, well, they were accessing them with their bodies and, and having like a pretty profound physical, emotional, mental, spiritual experience. With the unknowable, and I think that just that idea of that interfacing and that scale, that like point of access to something at scale, which God is at scale, I guess like kind of helped me, I guess like reorient all of these like vast immaterial struggles of how we deal with ecosystems and the environment to thinking about points of access and interface which involve physical being and physical experience and are embodied and in that way are literal, I guess.
But that's super interesting because in a way it's where the mystical and the ecological kind of come to meet, is this question of the limitations of the cognitive possibility versus the oceanic or the blah, 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 and therefore, and without which a sort of a true account of oneself or a true responsibility that is both personal and shared and political and societal towards climate crisis, no longer climate change,
Right.
is not, does not embed itself so easily into a kind of everyday life practice. So, but at the same time, aren't mystics in the Middle Ages very specific figure? I mean, we're not talking about everyone having...
Right.
Yes,
right?
and they were also cultivating those practices. I mean, sometimes it struck them, but sometimes it was also like
There was a lot of work.
involved in that love relationship. What do we have to do? I mean, in terms of the landscape as metaphor, which is something that I kind of started with, I was also kind of interested in like the metaphor of like the local, or like implanting yourself in a local context as opposed to the global, and how that metaphor just totally falls short when you think about how plants actually work, which is that they're certainly context and ecosystemic dependent and reflect the conditions in which they grow, but as we saw earlier today, they can be cut and propagated and cloned and moved, and they travel in ways that we don't understand. And so I think sometimes those metaphors really don't serve us because they preserve the natural as some sort of like external, passive, ancient entity. Which is not at all what's happening.
I would like to ask you both something that relates to different elements that you referred to in relation to becoming, metabolism and spirituality, no? On the one hand, you, Elvia, spoke about this process of becoming, no? Becoming plant, becoming tree, becoming other. Amy, you before moving or before delving into Emily Dickinson, you were talking about the experience of ingestion as a transformative process, no, and then the ultimate metabolic spiritual process of being that of the communion, no, of ingesting the body of Christ and therefore accepting or enrolling into an adventure of transformation, of eruption of a religious figure within you. And I would just like you to comment on this, yes, on the relation between the ingestion, the inside and the outside of the body, and the spirituality that that may occur through this process, or a system of transformation as well, no, of becoming.
Yeah, I was thinking about the thing that's interesting about it is that while, I mean, lots of things are interesting about that question and also about the sets of issues it invokes. I said, Paul was interested in making a distinction between the inner and the outer, the literal and the spiritual, and that to some extent collapses in somebody like Hadvig. That's both right and wrong. I mean, something is happening to her that affects her body, heart, and mind. I mean, that's the language she uses, it's the language Marguerite Pret uses, it's the language others use. And yet she still does maintain a distinction of what happens of unbidden and what happens externally, so that there's something that she wants to articulate about a different way in which some difference between receiving, she has a vision, for example, where Christ appears to her at the age of 30 and he gives her the Eucharist, and she eats the bread and drinks the wine, and she ingests in that way. But then she mingles all of her limbs with him such that they are one without any distinction. And then he disappears, he comes to naught so that she cannot see him anymore, and they're at that point so fully united that she can't make any distinction between himself and herself. And so what's external, what's internal, what's what's happening bodily, what's happening, at some level that is more than body plus. I don't know how to still talk about it. I think is really an open question with a lot of these figures from the Middle Ages, and that's where I think when I said I see Dickinson as potentially going further than Hadvig, although it's hard to go further than Hadvig, is because I think that she is so fully immersed in the material realm. She's extremely anxious about it, and so she has a kind of anxiety that Hadvig doesn't have. How much that anxiety is generated by the kind of Christianness with which she's surrounded and which she is rejecting, and how much that anxiety has to do with her fear that we're about to attend the funeral of God. I mean, she's so Nietzschean, it's crazy, and so that part is hard to. I haven't worked out yet. I don't know all the work well enough to have a strong opinion. And I also don't know if I ever will. It goes back to that unknowing. I think there's a willful refusal of syntactic clarity in her letters and in her poems, where syntactic and grammatical and other kinds of clarity, where I think she's refusing it. And one of the things she uses in her work, you couldn't see this from the poems I read, but she uses all these dashes rather than punctuation, so that everything is halting like this. Not as much the poems I read, but it's in a number of them. And it was reminding me of the breathing exercises from this morning, and the ritual space of those breathing exercises, and the kinds of physical transformation that kind of work with breath does, and to what extent her poetic practice was articulation of that kind of work, pointing towards another mode of inhabiting the body.
Yeah, along the lines of work and anxiety, I guess all I would say is that becoming other is a lot of work. It's labor, right? Being penetrated is a lot of work, and being permeable and allowing oneself to be permeated is it's hell. Like this is it's a really, construing that as a passive process is part of the problem. I mean, I would say. I guess that's sort of what I'm trying to say, like that it's everyone's responsibility to try and figure out what that's like, to become.
Well, both and to allow themselves to become permeable. I mean, everybody is, but to allow,
to claim, maybe.
To claim it, yeah. And to stop fighting against it and resisting it, which is itself a lot of work.
Yeah, and stop outsourcing it to people who are supposed to be doing it.
Yeah.
Shall we open? We're blind by these lights.
I was going to say, I don't know how you can possibly see.
But there are people around there with microphones. Any question?
That's better.
Just say yes, me.
Yes, neither do I.
Hi, and it feels a little intimidating to be the first person to ask a question. But I suppose as a male entity, as I might define myself, what is the role of the male in all of this, might you say? As broad a question as it might be.
Well, kind of what I just said, I guess.
I do think you have a paper where you show, I can't remember the name of the journal, where you show a lot of the images of Christ's side wind, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's this very sort of underground, but also very strong tradition of medieval and early modern and into modern in some groups, devotion to Christ's side wound. I said that once, and a friend of mine who was Jewish kept saying, Jesus didn't have a thigh wound. And I was like, no, not thigh. Anyway, side wound, the side wound, longinus sphere. So anyway, the side wound became the site from which, women and men both have visions of drinking the blood from Christ's side wound. There's images of Christ feeding someone with his side wound, and Mary.
I think I had one of him.
Did you have one up there? Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
And Mary feeding with her breast milk. In the Middle Ages, breast milk was seen as a form of blood. It was menstrual blood that had transformed itself through pregnancy, so that the blood of Christ's side wound is really a nurturing.
He's milking.
Say again?
Yeah, he's milking.
Yeah, he's milking, exactly. So it's a doubleness. It's a rendering oneself vulnerable so that one and that being extraordinarily difficult and involving a lot of work. It's also not outsourcing, as you said. Mary doesn't have to do it because Jesus is doing it. And yet, it's really important that those images involve Mary there also, because it's a kind of nurturing role without displacing the nurturing that those who do not have male bodies do. So it's a really, those images are very complicated, and the politics of thinking about those images in the present are really complicated. And I think there's a lot. I've had a student named Cameron Partridge, who's a trans, who has written about those side wounds in relationship to top surgery and thinking about what the transformation of one's body in relationship to some of these Christian images might mean. I wouldn't purport to say much about that other than that work exists and might be usefully thought about in relationship to these questions.
We're done.
Everybody's tired.
Well, we're done then, because I think we are at time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And a huge round of applause.
Thank you.